Hello Israel, back again with another video. Seems like tensions is high between Netanyahu and Trump. We know a war is getting ready to start Israel. Tensions high between two countries. Let's get into it.
Welcome Gaia TV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, big news on the front of international peace is the North African Sudan, the next state to normalize with Israel. Meanwhile, Palestinian President Abbas issues dismissal of the recent Israel-United Arab Emirates peace deal. And finally, one of the tastiest reports we've had lately on the program, ILTV takes you for a pickle like no other. Thousands of Israelis running to shelters across the region. 2 little girls getting injured while running for cover, receiving treatment later in hospital. 39 fires were also sparked in Israel as well Tuesday by the continued and growing use of incendiary balloons or kites flown indiscriminately into Israel from the Strip. 2 additional explosive devices attached to balloons were also discovered, police sappers responding and detonating them far from the public. The Palestinian Hamas terror group, for its part, claims to be instigating the recent violence in attempts to convince Israel to give in to their demands, such as opening the Kerem Shalom crossing, clearing more Gaza imports, extending Israeli work permits to 100,000 Gaza residents, greenlighting UN projects to boost employment, and extending the Gaza fishing zone to 20 nautical miles. Saying that Israel has raised sanctions on Gaza while the IDF has been operating against Hamas and other terror group targets in the Strip for the last 10 days.
אני חושב שהחמאס יעשה טעות גדולה מאוד אם הוא ימשיך בזה. הוא מקבל כבר עכשיו אינדיקציה לאן זה יוביל, הוא בוודאי יזכור לאן זה הוביל. אני מקווה שגם הג'יהאד האסלאמי יזכור לאן זה הוביל. אנחנו לא חסכנו בשום אמצעי, לרבות במקרה הצורך של התפתחות המערכה, גם של סיכולים ממוקדים, וגם היום אין לנו מגבלה כזאת.
Well, true to Israeli predictions, the latest peace agreement with the United Arab Emirates apparently is indeed inspiring others to follow suit. Sudan seemingly the next in line, officials saying that there's no more need for any enmity, calling the new UAE normalization a brave step that charts the right path for the rest of the Arab world. The Sudanese Foreign Ministry spokesperson is saying that the North African country and Israel are already in the midst of peace talks, and that Sudan would not have to sacrifice its values for such a deal. Israeli Premier Benjamin Netanyahu agreeing, saying that the whole region would benefit and that Israel will do whatever necessary to turn this vision into reality. But possibly to keep things mum, Sudan's acting foreign minister is denying knowledge of any peace talks with Israel, saying he was surprised by his spokesperson's claims and that the spokesperson, Haidar Badawi Sadiq, had no authorization to make such assertions. Meanwhile, Sadiq explains that he spoke as a private citizen and not as a government official, adding that the government should respect the people and tell them what's going on in secret regarding relations with Israel. Now, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is also finally weighing in on the Israel-UAE normalization in his first public remarks since the agreement was announced. But to the international community's surprise, Abu Mazen says that actually he's not too worried.
نحن لسنا قلقين بما يجري هنا وهناك من ترهات وخاصة في المرة الأخيرة في الأيام الأخيرة عندما أعلن عن اتفاق ثلاثي بين الإمارات وبين إسرائيل وبين أمريكا وهذا الاتفاق قائم على تطبيع العلاقات بين إسرائيل والإمارات.
Writing off the historic agreement as nonsense, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is addressing the new Israel-UAE deal in a meeting at his presidential compound. The meeting, including in rare form, members from Islamic terror group and rival party Hamas. But in line with assertions from Israel that this peace is just the first of many soon to follow, most Arab or Muslim states in the region are in support of Israel and the Emirates, quietly or otherwise. In fact, Palestinian officials have now called for an urgent meeting of the Arab League over the deal, few countries responding. A truth that Abbas is calling a stab in the back of the Palestinian cause. As for Israel's position, though, a snag in negotiations, centering around the reported sale of F-35 fighter jets and other advanced American arms to the Emirates. UAE officials insisting that Israel not only knew about, but okayed the sale as part of the normalization. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Benny Gantz, on the other hand, are denying such reports, saying that they stand firm against those stipulations.
אני אומר לכם שאסור לקחת סיכונים ביטחוניים. במידה אני חוזר ואומר לכם, צריך לקדם את ההסכם הזה. אני אשוחח עם שר ההגנה של האמירויות, כפי שגבי שוחח עם שר החוץ של האמירויות, נתמוך במאמץ הממשלתי הזה ונוודא היטב שהאינטרסים הביטחוניים שלנו יודעים להישמר. אפשר, רוני, לעשות הסכם שלום תוך גילוי אחריות ביטחונית. לא אפשר. צריך לעשות הסכם שלום תוך גילוי אחריות ביטחונית.
ישראל לא נתנה, בניגוד לטענות בשמאל ובתקשורת, הסכמה כלשהי לעסקת נשק כלשהי בין איחוד האמירויות וארצות הברית. להפך, ארצות הברית גם הבטיחה וחזרה והבטיחה שבכל מצב היא תשמור על היתרון האיכותי של ישראל. אין עבודות.
So what will happen with the sale of American arms to the Emirates? And what can or should Israel do about it? Joining us to discuss is founder and president of the Jerusalem Washington Center, Gideon Israel. Gideon, thanks for being with us.
Sure.
All right, now, we've been hearing a lot of conflicting reports about this, as we just heard from Benny Gantz and Netanyahu, you know, that this provision doesn't exist or shouldn't be happening, and then yet others, both in Israel and in the United States, are saying that, you know, it will happen, or at least it should be on the table. Who should be believed?
Well, I think everybody should be believed. I think everybody's telling the truth, and I think everybody's carefully worded what they said. I'm sure there's no provision in the agreement, and I'm sure there's no secret provision, and I'm sure that Netanyahu will oppose any sales of F-35s to the UAE. But what's going to happen is, after Netanyahu opposes it, or has already opposed it, the United States probably says, okay, it's in our interest to, you know, strengthen UAE and also to keep selling military hardware so other countries don't fill in that void. So how do we go from here? And then the Israelis probably say, okay, if you're going to give F-35s, then we're going to need this missile and that type of hardware. So
is this just a public negotiation, basically?
No, I don't think it's a public negotiation. I think it's just that the report was leaked and Netanyahu is denying it, but there will be some flexibility, and later I'm sure Netanyahu will announce, or someone will announce that, okay, Israel, let's say allowed, because the United States doesn't need Israel's permission, but Israel is okay with this sale, and the United States is going to keep that qualitative military edge by selling them this weapon.
Well, so that's what I was going to ask. You know, is it even realistic to ask the United States to deny such a trade from the UAE?
You can ask whatever you want, but it's certainly realistic, and it's certainly in Israel's interest. But also by asking it, also kind of gives Israel a little bit of leverage, because by saying this bothers us, so the United States, in order to go forward, they'll say, okay, so how do we compensate for that? And this whole like qualitative military edge thing, it's one big negotiation where, you know, it's ongoing, and as the years go on, okay, the Arabs you know, purchase more advanced equipment, and how does the United States compensate for that? So it's not something in stone.
So what are the pros and cons, really, of the Americans giving advanced weaponry to the UAE, from Israel's perspective?
Well, well, first of all, the United States has about 3,500 soldiers in the Emirates in various bases. They have joint exercises with the Emirates. Certainly, as a partner in the fight against Iran, so there's an advantage for Israel, for the United States selling this equipment. But also remember that if you're the country that sells another country military equipment, you also have a lot of leverage over that country, because they always need spare parts, and you always need to make sure that if a country says, listen, we're not going to supply you spare parts, so after a little while, the weapons, you can't use the weapons because you need those spare parts, and you have to look to another country. So by the United States selling weapons to the Emirates, it gives the United States could sort of leverage over the Emirates and sort of what they do with those weaponry.
Wow. All right. Well, it's going to be really interesting to see how this negotiation, as we're kind of calling it
I've
right
already,
now.
I've already told you what's going to happen, so I've already told you.
Basically, whatever they want to happen will happen. It sounds like. All right, Gideon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, well, aside from the possible trade of advanced military arms, the announcement of the Israel-UAE normalization also comes with huge opportunities in the private sector. The question is, what are these opportunities exactly? CEO and owner of the Tamir Fishman Investment House, Eldad Tamir, is here with us to discuss. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
All right, so,
China's military buildup notwithstanding, the People's Liberation Army and its components are not ready to fight the United States. The U.S., for its part, would surely prefer to avoid the chaos and uncertainty that any military conflict with China would create. Nevertheless, both China and the United States are making commitments in the South China Sea that each may find difficult to back away from. Over the past 2 weeks, these commitments have generated a war of words that analysts of the relationship have found troubling. The key problems focus on China's efforts to expand islands in the Spratlys, which could theoretically provide the basis for claims to territorial waters. The insistence of the United States on freedom of navigation could bring these tensions to a boil. It appears that Beijing is committed to defending the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea as an integral part of Chinese territory, a position that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea does not support. Washington has other ideas and has maintained that it will carry out freedom of navigation patrols in areas that China claims as territorial waters. The prospects for conflict are clear. If U.S. ships or aircraft enter waters that China claims, then Chinese sailors, soldiers, and pilots need to take great care about how they respond. A militarized response could quickly lead to escalation, especially if American forces suffer any kind of serious damage. In such a case, a freedom of navigation patrol could put China in an awkward position relative to the third party. China and the United States have already come close to conflict over aircraft collisions. When a U.S. Navy EP-3 reconnaissance plane collided with a People's Liberation Army naval F-8 fighter in 2001, it led to weeks of recriminations and negotiation before the crew of the P-3 was returned to the United States and the plane was returned. If China decides to go ahead and declare an air defense identification zone over the South China Sea, matters could become even more complicated.
Folks, I'm about to share a stock with you. A stock.
The United States made an elaborate display of ignoring China's air defense identification zone in the East China Sea. But China has greater interests and a greater presence in the South China Sea. Another declaration would almost certainly incur a similar reaction from the United States, putting American and Chinese planes into close proximity. Many analysts are arguing that the People's Liberation Army and Navy needs to push its submarines past the first island chain in order to seriously threaten U.S. access to China's littoral. Preparing for this would require increasing the tempo of the People's Liberation Army Navy's submarine operations, which would more often put China's boats in proximity with Japanese and American subs. To be sure, Chinese submarines are loud enough that U.S. boats should have plenty of time to get out of their way, but the same could be said of Soviet boats for much of the Cold War. Accidental war is rare, but not impossible. Common to all of these scenarios is the potential that Chinese, or less likely, American public opinion might become so inflamed as to box in policymakers. If Xi Jinping, who has made assertive foreign policy a cornerstone of his...
Israel, we know the war is going to happen. The question is when and where. That's the question, Israel. The biggest question is when. Because we don't know when this is going to pop off. But we know it's going to happen. And we should be getting prepared for it. Whether we in the city or the desert or the forest, we still need to be prepared for war. Because war is going to be everywhere.
Administration feels that he cannot back down and survive politically, then things could get unpredictable very quickly. As U.S. military news channel has argued, China is playing offense in the South China Sea. By establishing facts on the ground, it is creating a situation in which normal U.S. behavior looks like destabilizing intervention. What's less than clear is that Beijing fully understands the risks of this strategy, or the dangers of pushing the United States Navy on freedom of navigation, one of the long-term core interests of the United States. And given that governments sometimes don't even understand that they're playing a dangerous game until they find themselves in the middle of it, a great deal of caution is warranted. Thank you.
What we don't want, Israel, is the war to catch us off guard and by surprise. Although, I have a feeling that it just might. Because they're not going to tell us, Israel, when this war is going to be crack-a-lacking. But we know it's coming. We just don't want it to catch us by surprise and off guard. We want to be on our Q's and P's and Q's, I should say, where we are aware of this war, and we can spread the news, Israel, that this war is coming or it's beginning to happen, so we can be prepared and not be caught off guard.
This is $100 or a C note or a Benjamin, whatever you want to call it. I'm about to show you how you can reliably turn this into 200, 300, even 500 bucks.